The boy who survived the Great Depression. In the autumn of 1928, America seemed unstoppable. From the towering skyscrapers of New York City to the endless wheat fields of Kansas, people believed they were living in the greatest nation the world had ever seen. Newspapers celebrated record-breaking stock prices, new factories opened almost every week, radios filled homes with music and news, automobiles crowded city streets like never before. People called it the Roaring Twenties. It was an age of jazz, innovation, and dreams. For millions of Americans, the future looked brighter than ever. But history has a strange habit. Sometimes the brightest sunrise hides the darkest storm. This is the story of one ordinary American boy who would lose almost everything and discover what truly mattered. His name was Samuel Carter. Samuel was 12 years old. He lived with his parents and younger sister on a small farm just outside Wichita, Kansas. Their farmhouse wasn't fancy. It had white wooden walls, a red barn, and a windmill that squeaked whenever the Kansas wind blew across the prairie. Every morning before sunrise, Samuel helped his father feed the chickens. Then came the cows, then the horses. Only after the work was finished did he walk 3 miles to the small country schoolhouse. Life wasn't easy, but it was peaceful. His father, Thomas Carter, believed in 3 simple rules: work hard, tell the truth, and never give up. Samuel heard those words almost every day. His mother, Mary Carter, had a different kind of wisdom. She believed kindness was worth more than money. Every Sunday after church, she baked extra bread for neighbors who had less than they did. Someday, she often told Samuel, someone may need your help just as much. Samuel never forgot those words. The Carter family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. They owned 20 acres of farmland. They had 2 horses, 3 cows, dozens of chickens, a vegetable garden, and enough food to survive every winter. To Samuel, life felt almost perfect. His greatest worry was whether he could beat his best friend, Henry, in the annual county baseball game. Sometimes he dreamed of becoming a famous baseball player. Other times he imagined becoming an engineer who designed giant bridges across America. At 12 years old, every dream seemed possible. Across the country, millions of families felt exactly the same. The American economy was booming. Banks encouraged people to borrow money. Factories produced more goods than ever before. Cars became affordable. Families bought refrigerators, radios, and washing machines on credit. Many believed the good times would never end. Even ordinary workers invested in the stock market. People who had never owned a single share suddenly became investors. Every week, newspapers printed headlines announcing new record highs. Wall Street became the symbol of endless wealth. Some investors borrowed huge amounts of money just to buy more stocks. Few realized how dangerous that really was. One October afternoon, Samuel's father drove into town with a wagon full of fresh vegetables. The town looked busier than ever. New stores had opened. The bank had recently expanded into a larger building. Even the barber proudly talked about buying stock in automobile companies. While unloading potatoes at the market, Samuel overheard 2 businessmen talking. "You can't lose money anymore," one of them laughed. "The stock market only goes up." The other man smiled. "I borrowed $5,000 last month. I've already doubled it." Samuel didn't fully understand, but his father remained silent. On the drive home, Samuel finally asked, "Papa, why don't we buy stocks too?" Thomas looked across the endless fields before answering. "Because when something sounds too easy, it usually isn't." Samuel nodded. He wasn't sure what his father meant, but years later, those words would echo in his memory. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered the fields. The Carter family gathered around the fireplace every evening. Mary read adventure stories aloud. Samuel carved small wooden animals with his pocket knife. His little sister Emily laughed whenever the family dog chased its own tail across the living room. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen prairie. Inside, everything felt safe. No one could imagine how quickly life could change. Far away in New York City, thousands of businessmen rushed through Wall Street every morning. Telephones rang constantly. Stockbrokers shouted prices across crowded trading floors. Millions of dollars changed hands every hour. Fortunes were made before lunch. Some people became millionaires almost overnight. Others believed America had entered a new era where economic crashes belonged only to history books. Confidence spread faster than facts. Greed quietly replaced caution. Back in Kansas, spring finally arrived. Green fields stretched toward the horizon. Samuel helped plant corn alongside his father. The work was exhausting, but there was satisfaction in watching tiny seeds disappear into the rich soil. His father smiled. "Everything starts with faith. You plant today and hope tomorrow." Samuel looked across the endless farmland. The future seemed limitless.
That summer brought county fairs, baseball games, carnivals, music. Children laughed beneath colorful flags. Families gathered for picnics. The nation celebrated prosperity. Even newspapers predicted another decade of endless growth. No one wanted to hear warnings. No one wanted to believe that the foundation beneath America's success was becoming dangerously fragile. Like a house built on sand, everything appeared strong until the storm arrived. Late one evening, Samuel noticed his father sitting alone on the front porch. He wasn't reading. He wasn't smoking his pipe. He simply stared into the distance. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked. Thomas smiled gently. "I've lived long enough to know something." "What?" "Good times never last forever." Samuel frowned. "But why not?" He looked toward the setting sun. "Because people forget how quickly fortune can change." The boy didn't understand. How could America ever fail? The towns were growing. Factories were busy. Banks were lending money. Everyone seemed happy. Surely tomorrow would be even better, wouldn't it? But somewhere, far beyond the quiet Kansas farm, events had already begun moving towards one of the greatest financial disasters in human history. Within a year, banks would collapse, businesses would close, millions would lose their jobs, families would lose their homes, children would go hungry, and Samuel Carter would soon begin the hardest journey of his young life. The storm was coming, and no one, not even the wisest Americans, could stop it.
By the fall of 1929, America still believed it was the richest nation on earth. Factories continued to produce automobiles by the thousands. Banks encouraged families to borrow money. Newspapers proudly celebrated new records on Wall Street almost every week. For years, it had seemed impossible to lose. Many Americans believed prosperity itself had become permanent. But beneath the surface, the economy had become dangerously unstable. Stock prices had risen far beyond what many companies were truly worth. Millions of people had borrowed money to buy stocks, hoping prices would continue climbing forever. It was a gamble. And like every gamble, eventually someone had to lose. No one imagined that the greatest financial collapse in American history was only days away. On the morning of October 24, 1929, nervous whispers filled the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. At first, only a few investors began selling. Then dozens, then hundreds. Soon, thousands of frightened investors rushed to sell their shares before prices dropped even further. Telephones rang without stopping. Stockbrokers shouted over one another. Papers flew through the air. For the first time in years, panic had replaced confidence. The newspapers later called the day Black Thursday. Banks and wealthy investors stepped in, buying large amounts of stock to calm the market. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Many Americans breathed a sigh of relief. The crisis is over, some newspapers declared. But they were wrong. Very wrong. 5 days later, on October 29, 1929, history changed forever. That morning began like any other. But before noon, fear swept through Wall Street like a hurricane. Millions of shares flooded the market. There were more sellers than buyers. Prices collapsed. Every minute brought new losses. Fortunes that had taken decades to build disappeared in hours. Some investors watched their entire life savings vanish before lunch. By the end of the day, more than 16 million shares had changed hands, a record unlike anything America had ever seen. The day became known forever as Black Tuesday. Hundreds of miles away in Kansas, Samuel Carter knew nothing about Wall Street. He was helping his father repair a broken fence after a strong autumn storm. The air smelled of fresh earth. Leaves drifted across the fields. It seemed like an ordinary day. That evening, however, the family gathered around their small radio after dinner. The announcer's normally cheerful voice sounded unusually serious. Today, the New York Stock Exchange suffered one of the greatest declines in American history. Billions of dollars have been lost. Financial experts remain uncertain what comes next. Mary looked worried. Samuel glanced between his parents. What does it mean? It means some people have lost a great deal of money. Will it affect us? I hope not. But his voice carried little confidence. During the following weeks, the news became worse. Every newspaper headline seemed darker than the one before. Factories slowed production, businesses stopped hiring, banks became nervous. Many people rushed to withdraw their savings, fearing their banks might fail. The problem was simple. Banks had loaned out much of the money deposited by customers. They didn't have enough cash to repay everyone at once. When too many people demanded their money back, the banks collapsed. One after another. Across the country.
Soon the effects reached Kansas. One cold November morning, Samuel accompanied his father into town. Something felt different. The streets were unusually quiet. The hardware store had fewer customers. Several shops displayed handwritten signs. Closing sale. Everything must go. Outside the town bank stood a long line of anxious people. Some had waited since sunrise. Everyone wanted their savings. Everyone feared losing everything. Samuel watched adults whisper nervously. No one smiled. No one laughed. Fear had replaced hope. Thomas met an old friend outside the post office. His name was Mr. Henderson. Usually cheerful, he looked exhausted. I lost everything, Henderson admitted. My savings, my investments, my business. It's all gone. Thomas placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. I'm sorry. Henderson forced a weak smile. I thought I was getting rich. I was only getting deeper into debt. Those words stayed with Samuel long after they returned home. Winter arrived once again, but this year felt different. Prices for crops dropped sharply. Farmers worked just as hard as before, yet earned far less money. Corn, wheat, milk, eggs, everything sold for lower prices. Meanwhile, bills remained the same. Many families could no longer pay their loans. Banks began taking farms from people who had worked the land for generations. Entire families packed their belongings onto wagons and left. No one knew where they were going, only that they could no longer stay. One snowy evening, Samuel overheard his parents talking about whether they thought the children had gone to bed. "We're behind on the mortgage," whispered Mary. "I know." The bank sent another letter. "I know." "What are we going to do?" Thomas remained silent. Finally, he answered quietly. "We keep working. It's all we can do." Mary wiped away tears. Samuel lay awake beneath his blanket. For the first time in his life, he heard fear in his father's voice. Christmas arrived, but it wasn't like previous years. There were no expensive presents, no new toys, no fancy dinners. Mary stitched old clothes into new ones for the children. Thomas carved Samuel a small wooden baseball bat. Emily received a handmade cloth doll. After opening their simple gifts, Mary smiled. "We may not have much, but we still have each other." Samuel hugged his mother tightly. Even at 12 years old, he understood that something precious was slipping away. Not just money, but the feeling of certainty. Across America, unemployment continued to rise. Factories closed. Railroads reduced workers. Construction projects stopped. By the end of the year, millions had already lost their jobs. Many believed recovery would come quickly. Most experts predicted the economy would improve within months. They had no idea the worst was still ahead. The Great Depression had only begun. As spring approached in 1930, Thomas Carter stood in his fields watching the young crops grow. Normally, planting season filled him with hope. This year, he wasn't sure hope was enough. Samuel joined him. "Do you think things will get better?" Thomas looked toward the horizon. "I don't know." Then he smiled gently. "But we keep planting." "Why?" "Because giving up guarantees failure. As long as we keep trying, there's still a chance." Samuel nodded. Those words became his strength in the difficult years that followed. Within months, the Carter family's struggle would become even harder. The harvest would fail to bring enough money. The bank would make an impossible demand, and Samuel would be forced to leave the only home he had ever known. The road ahead would test his courage, his faith, and everything his parents had taught him. The Great Depression was no longer a story on the radio. It had arrived at the Carter family's front door. End of part 2. Next, part 3, losing the farm. In the next chapter, Samuel's family faces foreclosure, heartbreaking decisions, and the painful day they are forced to leave their beloved Kansas farm in search of a new life. The emotional journey deepens as survival becomes their only goal.
By the spring of 1930, the Carter family had done everything they knew to survive. Thomas Carter worked from sunrise until long after sunset. Mary grew vegetables, canned fruit, sewed clothes, and stretched every dollar as far as possible. Samuel harder than ever before, yet somehow they were falling further behind. The fields looked healthy. Rows of wheat waved gently beneath the Kansas wind. The corn stood tall. The cattle remained strong. To anyone passing by, the Carter farm looked successful. But appearances could be deceiving. Crop prices had fallen so low that selling a full harvest barely covered the cost of growing it. Thomas often stared at his ledger late into the night. He carefully added the numbers again and again, hoping they might somehow change. Seed costs, feed costs, mortgage payments, property taxes, equipment repairs. Every column ended the same way. More debt, less hope. One afternoon, Samuel found his father sitting alone inside the barn. The old man was turning his wedding ring around his finger while staring at the floor. Samuel had never seen him so quiet. "Papa?" Thomas looked up with a tired smile. "Come here, son." Samuel sat beside him on an old wooden crate. "Do you remember when we planted that big oak tree near the house?" Samuel smiled. "I was 6. You said someday it would give us shade?" Thomas nodded. "It grew because every year we took care of it." He paused. "Sometimes, no matter how hard you care for something, life has other plans." Samuel didn't fully understand, but he could see tears forming in his father's eyes. That frightened him more than anything. Weeks later, another letter arrived from the bank. Thomas opened it silently. Mary watched his face. She already knew the answer before he spoke. "They're giving us 30 days. No one said anything. Even the ticking clock on the kitchen wall seemed louder than usual. Emily looked confused. 30 days for what? Mary forced a smile. "Oh, just some paperwork," but Samuel knew better. The following Saturday, Thomas drove into town to meet the bank manager. Samuel insisted on coming. Inside the bank, everything felt strangely cold. The manager, Mr. Collins, removed his glasses before speaking. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I truly am." Thomas leaned forward. "I've never missed a payment until this year." "I know. Give me more time. I'll pay every dollar." Mr. Collins sighed. "I wish I could, but the bank is under pressure too. If we don't collect outstanding loans, we may close ourselves." Thomas lowered his head. "So that's it?" "I'm afraid so." The bank manager quietly slid a document across the desk. "If payment isn't made by next month, the farm becomes bank property." For several long seconds, no one spoke. Samuel watched his father's weathered hands tremble slightly. It was the first time he realized adults could feel helpless too. The ride home was silent. Dust rose behind the old wagon. Fields stretched endlessly beneath a bright blue sky. Nature looked exactly as it always had. Only the Carter family's future had changed. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "Can we lose the farm?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes." "What happens then?" "We start over." "Where?" "I don't know." Those 3 words, "I don't know," were words Samuel had never expected to hear from his father. News spread quickly through the community. Neighbor after neighbor faced the same nightmare. The Johnson family lost their dairy farm. The Millers auctioned their horses. The Andersons packed everything into one wagon and headed west. Every week another family disappeared. Empty houses became common. Fields once full of life now stood abandoned. The Great Depression wasn't just destroying banks, it was destroying communities. One Sunday after church, the pastor spoke with unusual emotion. He looked across the congregation before saying, "There are difficult days ahead, but remember, your home is more than wood and nails. Your wealth is more than money. The greatest treasure any family possesses is one another." Many people quietly wiped away tears. Some knew they would soon lose everything except the people sitting beside them. 30 days passed faster than anyone expected. Then came the morning Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. A black automobile slowly pulled into the farmyard. 2 men stepped out. One carried a leather briefcase, the other held several official papers. Thomas walked toward them. Mary stood on the porch holding Emily's hand. Samuel watched from the barn. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. No one raised their voice. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue about. The decision had already been made. The bank had taken the farm. That afternoon, the Carter family began packing. Not everything, only what they could carry. A few blankets, family photographs, kitchen pots, clothing, Thomas's toolbox, Mary's Bible, Samuel's baseball glove, Emily's handmade doll. Everything else would stay behind. The furniture, the piano, the wagon, the barn. Even the family dog had to remain with a nearby neighbor. Samuel hugged the old dog tightly. "I'll come back someday." The dog wagged its tail, not knowing this goodbye would last forever. As the sun began to set, Samuel walked one last time around the property. He touched the fence he had helped build. He stood beneath the oak tree planted years before. It had grown tall and strong, exactly as his father had promised. He remembered climbing its branches, swinging from an old rope, laughing with Emily, watching fireflies on warm summer nights. Every memory seemed to whisper goodbye. That evening, Thomas gathered the family on the porch. No one wanted to go inside. Tomorrow, it would no longer be their home. The prairie stretched peacefully toward the horizon. A gentle breeze moved through the wheat. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Thomas looked at his children. "I want you both to remember something. You can lose land. You can lose money. You can even lose a house. But no one can take away your honesty. No one can take away your courage. And no one can take away what you've learned." Samuel nodded silently. He would remember those words for the rest of his life. Before dawn the next morning, the family climbed into an old borrowed truck. Most of their belongings fit into only a few wooden crates. Samuel looked back one final time. The farmhouse stood quietly beneath the morning sky. The windmill slowly turned. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. It already looked like someone else's home. As the truck rolled away, Emily began crying softly. Mary wrapped an arm around her daughter.
Thomas kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. Samuel watched the farm disappear into the distance until it became nothing more than a tiny white dot against the endless Kansas prairie. Then, it vanished completely. Thousands of American families experienced similar farewells during the early years of the Great Depression. They left behind homes built by parents and grandparents. Some searched for factory jobs. Others followed rumors of work hundreds of miles away. Many never found either. The road ahead offered no guarantees, only uncertainty. For the Carter family, that road would lead west, toward unfamiliar towns, temporary jobs, hungry nights, and challenges greater than anything they had ever imagined. But somewhere beyond those hardships, Samuel would discover that true wealth was never measured by money. It was measured by courage, kindness, and the determination to keep moving forward when every reason to stop stood in your way. The journey had only just begun.
In the summer of 1930, the Carter family no longer had a place to call home. Everything they owned was packed into the back of a weathered truck borrowed from Thomas's older brother. There was no destination marked on a map, only a single goal: find work, any work. Every morning, Thomas started the truck before sunrise. Every evening, he hoped the next town would offer an opportunity. Most did not. The highways of America were changing. More and more families were leaving their farms behind. Old trucks carried mattresses tied down with rope. Horse-drawn wagons rolled beside automobiles. Children sat quietly among wooden crates, holding tightly to the few possessions their families had managed to save. Some families had been traveling for weeks. Others had been on the road for months. Everywhere Samuel looked, he saw the same expressions: tired eyes, hope mixed with fear, and parents trying to hide their worries from their children. The Carter family stopped in a small Kansas town where a grain warehouse was rumored to be hiring. Thomas walked inside while Samuel waited outside with his mother and sister. For nearly half an hour, they watched men enter the building one after another. Each man carried the same hopeful look. Most came back out with their heads lowered. Finally, Thomas emerged. Samuel immediately recognized the answer before his father spoke. They already filled the positions. "How many jobs?" Mary asked. "3. "How many applicants?" Thomas gave a faint smile. "More than 200. No one said another word. The truck started once again. The road stretched endlessly ahead. As the weeks passed, money disappeared quickly. They stopped staying in boarding houses. Instead, they slept wherever they could, sometimes beneath the stars, sometimes beside quiet rivers, sometimes in church parking lots where kind pastors allowed traveling families to rest for the night. Mary cooked simple meals over a small campfire: beans, cornbread, potatoes. When food became scarce, the portions grew smaller. Samuel often noticed his parents claiming they were not hungry. He understood what they were really doing. They were giving their food to the children. One evening, while camping beside a dusty road, Samuel wandered toward another nearby campfire. Several families had gathered together. Children played with homemade toys. Adults shared stories about towns they had visited. An elderly man invited Samuel to sit beside him. "My name's Walter," he said. "I used to own a hardware store." Samuel looked surprised. "What happened?" Walter stared into the fire. "I believed the good times would never end. I borrowed too much. When business slowed, I lost everything." He smiled sadly. "But I'm still here." Samuel nodded. It was the first time he realized that people from every walk of life were suffering. Not just farmers, not just factory workers. The Depression had spared almost no one. As they traveled farther west, they reached Oklahoma. There they found hundreds of families living in makeshift camps. Old tents, wooden shacks, cars with blankets hanging from the windows. Entire communities had formed from people with nowhere else to go. Children chased each other through the dust as if nothing had changed. Laughter still existed, even in the hardest places. Mary whispered to Samuel, "People are stronger than they know." He never forgot those words. One afternoon, Thomas heard that a construction crew needed laborers. He stood in line with nearly 300 men. The foreman walked slowly down the line. He pointed to a handful of workers. You. Each selected man stepped forward. The others waited. Finally, the foreman shook his head. "That's enough." The remaining man quietly turned away. No shouting, no anger, only disappointment. Thomas returned to the truck carrying the same empty lunch bucket he had taken that morning. Emily asked hopefully, "Did you get the job?" Thomas smiled gently. "Not today." That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He climbed onto the roof of the truck and looked at the stars. The sky seemed endless, exactly as it had over their farm. He wondered if home still looked the same.
Did the oak tree still stand proudly near the porch? Did someone else now feed the chickens? Did another family sleep in his old bedroom? He missed everything. The smell of fresh cut hay, the sound of the windmill, even the creaking floorboards of the old farmhouse. For the first time since leaving Kansas, Samuel cried, quietly, so no one would hear. The next morning brought an unexpected surprise. A local church had organized a free breakfast for traveling families. Volunteers handed out oatmeal, fresh bread, and warm coffee. Samuel had never tasted a meal that felt so comforting. An elderly woman serving food noticed how quickly Emily finished her bowl. Without saying a word, she quietly filled it again. Mary thanked her with tears in her eyes. The woman simply smiled. "We're all neighbors now." That sentence stayed with Samuel forever. In difficult times, strangers often became family. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The truck grew older. Its tires became worn. Gasoline was carefully measured. Every penny mattered. Sometimes Thomas earned $1 unloading freight. Sometimes $2 repairing fences. Occasionally he found a full week's work. But every job eventually ended. Then the search began again. Still, he never complained. Every evening, no matter how tired he was, he reminded his children, tomorrow is another chance. Late one afternoon, while driving through western Oklahoma, the family encountered something Samuel had never seen before. The sky turned strangely brown. The wind became stronger. Birds disappeared. The air filled with fine dust. Within minutes, daylight faded into darkness. Thomas quickly stopped the truck. "Everyone stay inside." The storm arrived with terrifying force. Dust slammed against the truck like ocean waves crashing against a ship. The wind howled so loudly that no one could hear each other. Mary covered Emily's face with a damp cloth to help her breathe. Samuel closed his eyes tightly. The storm lasted nearly an hour. When it finally passed, everything was covered in thick brown dust. Fields, roads, trees, even the sky seemed gray. Thomas stared silently across the ruined landscape. "This land is dying," he whispered. Neither he nor Samuel knew it yet, but these devastating dust storms would soon become known as the Dust Bowl, forcing hundreds of thousands of families to leave the Great Plains in search of survival. For many Americans, the Depression was no longer just an economic disaster. Nature itself had turned against them. A few days later, while refilling water at a small service station, Thomas overheard two truck drivers talking. "They're hiring fruit pickers in California. They say there's work in the orchards. It isn't much, but it's better than nothing." That evening, Thomas spread an old road map across the hood of the truck. California. It seemed impossibly far away. Nearly 1,500 miles. Mountains, deserts, unknown roads. Mary looked at him. "Do you think it's true?" Thomas folded the map carefully. "I don't know, but staying here won't change anything." Samuel watched his parents exchange determined looks. For the first time in months, they had a destination. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee. It was simply hope, and sometimes hope was enough to keep moving. Within days, the Carter family packed what little they had left and pointed the truck westward. Ahead lay deserts, mountains, exhaustion, and hardship unlike anything they had yet experienced. But somewhere beyond the horizon, California waited. Whether it held opportunity or disappointment, no one could say. Samuel took one last look at the endless plains behind them. Then he faced forward. The road stretched toward a future no one could predict. And for the Carter family, the greatest test of their courage was only beginning.
By the autumn of 1930, the Carter family had made their decision. They would leave the Great Plains behind. Ahead of them lay a journey of nearly 1,500 miles, a journey across dusty highways, scorching deserts, and towering mountains. Their destination was California. People called it the Golden State. Rumors spread from town to town that orchards needed workers, farms were hiring, and anyone willing to work hard could earn enough to start over. No one knew how much of it was true. But hope has always traveled faster than facts. For families with nothing left to lose, even a rumor was enough. Early one cold morning, Thomas folded an old road map and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Mary packed the last of their canned vegetables. Samuel checked the truck's tires, while Emily carefully held on to her rag doll. The old engine coughed several times before finally roaring to life. Thomas smiled. "Come on, old friend. One more journey." The truck slowly rolled west. Behind them, Kansas disappeared into the morning mist. The highways were crowded like Samuel had never seen before. Hundreds of old cars, broken-down trucks, horse-drawn wagons, families carrying everything they owned. Some vehicles were piled so high with furniture that Samuel wondered how they stayed upright. Children waved to one another through dusty windows.
Parents exchanged tired smiles at roadside stops. No one knew each other's names, yet everyone understood the same struggle. Several days into the journey, the Carter family stopped beside a small roadside diner. A handwritten sign hung in the window. Soup, 5 cents. Thomas counted the coins in his pocket. There wasn't enough money for 4 meals. Without saying anything, he ordered only 2 bowls. Mary quietly divided the soup between Samuel and Emily. Samuel looked at his father. "Aren't you eating?" Thomas smiled. "I had breakfast earlier." Samuel knew that wasn't true. He quietly pushed half of his bowl toward his father. Thomas shook his head. "You need it more." Samuel answered softly. "We both do." For a moment neither spoke. Then Thomas accepted the spoon. Sometimes love wasn't shown through words. Sometimes it was shared one spoonful at a time. As they traveled further west, they began driving along Route 66, the highway that would later become one of America's most famous roads. At the time, it was simply a lifeline. Every mile carried families chasing another chance. Roadside camps appeared almost every evening. Some people played guitars around campfires. Others repaired worn-out tires or patched torn clothing. Children laughed despite empty stomachs. The human spirit proved stronger than anyone expected. One evening, Samuel met a boy about his own age named Daniel. Daniel's family had come from Oklahoma after losing everything during the drought. The 2 boys skipped stones across a nearby creek while their parents prepared dinner. "Do you think California is really different?" Samuel shrugged. "My dad says there are orange trees everywhere." Samuel laughed. "I've never even tasted an orange." Daniel smiled. "When we get there, we'll eat as many as we want." It sounded like a wonderful dream. Neither boy realized how difficult reality would be. The weather became hotter each day. Dust coated everything. Clothes, food, blankets. Even drinking water sometimes tasted like dirt. The truck struggled on steep hills. Every strange engine noise made Thomas nervous. If the truck failed, their journey would end. One afternoon it finally happened. The engine sputtered, coughed, then stopped. Silence. Thomas climbed out and opened the hood. Steam rose into the hot afternoon air. Samuel joined him. "Can we fix it?" Thomas examined the engine carefully. "I hope so." They spent nearly 4 hours repairing a cracked hose using scraps of rubber and wire. When Thomas finally turned the key again, the engine started. Everyone cheered. Even strangers camping nearby applauded. On the road west, everyone celebrated small victories. Crossing the Texas Panhandle, the Carter family witnessed endless lines of abandoned farms. Windmills stood motionless. Windows were boarded shut. Fields that had once produced wheat now lay buried beneath drifting sand. The Dust Bowl had transformed fertile farmland into a wasteland. Nature had become another enemy. Mary quietly whispered, "It looks like the earth itself is crying." Samuel looked across the empty horizon. He wondered how many families had once left inside those silent homes. Days later they entered New Mexico. The mountains rose in the distance like giant stone walls. The air became cooler. The scenery changed. For the first time in months, Samuel felt something besides worry. Wonder. He had never seen mountains before. They seemed endless. Ancient. Unmovable. Thomas smiled as he noticed his son's amazement. "The world is bigger than we think." Samuel nodded. "And maybe, so are our chances." One afternoon, while climbing a steep mountain road, the truck suddenly lost power. It slowed. Slower. Then nearly stopped. Thomas shifted gears. The engine groaned loudly. For several tense moments, it seemed impossible to continue. Finally, everyone climbed out. Even Emily pushed from behind. Step by step. Foot by foot.
Together, they helped the truck reach the top. Once again, the family discovered something important. Some mountains cannot be climbed alone. After nearly 3 weeks on the road, food became dangerously scarce. Only a few coins remained. Mary carefully counted slices of bread. 1, 2, 3, 4. Enough for one final meal. That evening, as they prepared to eat, an elderly traveler approached their camp. He looked exhausted. His clothes were torn. He carried nothing except a small blanket. "I haven't eaten today," he admitted quietly. Samuel looked at the bread, then at the stranger. Without hesitation, Mary handed the man one of their slices. Thomas added another. The old man stared at them in disbelief. "You need this more than I do." Thomas smiled gently. "Maybe. But tomorrow someone might help us." The stranger thanked them repeatedly before disappearing into the darkness. Samuel asked, "Weren't you afraid we'd go hungry?" Thomas looked toward the stars. Courage isn't only helping when life is easy. It's helping when life is hard. Those words settled deep into Samuel's heart. Finally, late one golden afternoon, the Carter family reached the California state line. A weathered sign welcomed travelers. "Welcome to California." Emily clapped excitedly. "We made it." Samuel smiled for the first time in weeks. Mary quietly wiped away tears. Thomas removed his hat and looked toward the western horizon. After nearly a month on the road, they had arrived. But their journey was far from over. California was beautiful. Rolling hills. Vast orchards. Rows of orange and peach trees stretching farther than Samuel could see. The air smelled different. Fresh. Sweet. Full of promise. For a brief moment, everyone believed the hardest days were behind them. They were wrong. The roads into California were already crowded with thousands of desperate families just like the Carters. There were far more workers than jobs. Farm owners could choose anyone they wanted. Wages were falling lower every week. Some families waited months before finding steady work. Others never did. The dream of California was real. But so was the struggle. As the sun disappeared beyond the distant hills, the Carter family parked beside a crowded migrant camp. Hundreds of tents filled the open field. Children played between rows of makeshift shelters. Smoke rose from dozens of campfires. Voices echoed through the evening air. Samuel looked around. So many people. Thomas nodded. They're all searching for the same thing. What? A second chance. Samuel took a deep breath. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But one thing had become certain. Home was no longer a place. Home was wherever his family stood together. And as long as they remained together, there was still hope.
The Carter family had finally reached California. For nearly a month, they had crossed endless highways, dusty plains, towering mountains, and scorching deserts. The words, "Welcome to California," had filled them with hope. But hope alone could not fill an empty stomach. As dawn broke on their first morning in California, reality arrived with the rising sun. The migrant camp where they spent the night was already awake. Smoke drifted from dozens of campfires. Children carried buckets of water from a nearby well. Women prepared simple breakfasts of oatmeal and bread. Men stood quietly beside the road, waiting for trucks from nearby farms. Every face carried the same question. Will today be the day I find work? Samuel had never seen so many people searching for the same opportunity. The camp stretched farther than he could see. Hundreds of families lived in tents made from canvas, old blankets, and pieces of scrap wood. Some had been there for weeks, others for months. Just after sunrise, an old pickup truck rolled into the camp. The driver climbed onto the hood and shouted loudly, "Need 20 workers for orange picking." Instantly, hundreds of men rushed forward. Thomas joined them. Samuel watched in amazement. There were far more workers than jobs. The farmer slowly looked over the crowd. He chose only the strongest-looking men. You. One by one, 20 workers climbed into the truck. Thomas wasn't among them. The truck disappeared in a cloud of dust. The remaining men quietly walked back toward their tents. No arguments, no complaints, only disappointment. It had become part of daily life. For the next several days, the same routine repeated. Wake before sunrise, wait for work, hope, go home empty-handed. Sometimes Thomas earned a day's wage loading fruit crates. Other days he repaired fences or dug irrigation ditches. But the work never lasted. There were simply too many workers and too few jobs. Farm owners knew this. Many lowered wages because desperate people would accept almost anything. A full day's work often earned barely enough to buy food for one family. One afternoon, Samuel wandered through the camp carrying a bucket of water. Near the edge of the settlement, he noticed an elderly man sitting beneath a large oak tree. Unlike most people, the old man wasn't waiting for work. Instead, he was reading a thick book. Curious, Samuel walked closer. The man looked up and smiled. "Good afternoon." Samuel smiled back. "What are you reading?" "A history book." Samuel looked surprised. "You read history for fun?" The old man laughed softly. "History teaches us something important." "What's that?" "That hard times never last forever." Samuel sat beside him. "My name's Samuel." "I'm Benjamin Harris." From that day forward, the two became friends. Benjamin had once been a schoolteacher in San Francisco. Before the Depression, he had taught history to hundreds of students. When schools began cutting budgets, he lost his job. Unable to find another position, he eventually joined the thousands of unemployed workers traveling across California. Despite losing everything, Benjamin had never stopped reading. Every evening, children gathered beneath the oak tree while he told stories about America's past. He spoke about explorers crossing unknown lands, inventors who failed dozens of times before succeeding, presidents who led the country through impossible challenges. Samuel never missed a story. One evening, Benjamin asked the children, "What do all great Americans have in common?" Several children guessed. They were rich? They were smart? They were famous? Benjamin smiled. No. They refused to quit. He looked directly at Samuel. Remember that. Success belongs to people who keep walking after everyone else stops. Samuel repeated those words to himself over and over. As summer turned into autumn, life in the camp became more difficult. Food prices rose, jobs became scarcer. Families shared whatever little they had. If one family found work, they often helped neighbors buy food. Children played together regardless of where they had come from. The Depression had erased many differences. Rich, poor, farmer, teacher, business owner. Everyone now stood in the same line. Waiting. Hoping. Surviving. By the winter of 1931, the Carter family had settled into a simple routine. Every morning before sunrise, Thomas and Mary walked to the peach orchard. Samuel, now 13 years old, worked beside them whenever he could. Emily had recovered from her illness and spent her days helping other children at the camp gather firewood and carry water. Life was still difficult. They still lived in a canvas tent. Money was still scarce. But they had something they hadn't felt in a long time: stability. For the first time since losing their farm, tomorrow didn't seem quite so frightening. One cold December morning, Samuel woke before everyone else. Unable to sleep, he walked toward the nearby orchard. The trees stood bare, their branches reaching into the pale morning sky. Winter had arrived, and the harvest was over. Most seasonal workers had already left. Only a few remained behind, repairing fences and preparing the orchards for spring. As Samuel wandered between the rows of trees, something caught his eye. Near the base of one tree lay an old leather wallet. It was covered in dust, but looked well made. He picked it up. Inside were several folded dollar bills, more money than Samuel had seen in months. There was also a small family photograph, and a business card with a name: Edward Whitmore. Samuel looked around. The orchard was empty. No one had seen him. For a long moment he simply stood there. His family desperately needed money. The tent leaked whenever it rained. Emily needed new shoes. Mary's coat was beginning to fall apart. Thomas's boots had been repaired so many times they barely resembled boots anymore. The money inside the wallet could buy food for weeks. No one would ever know. Samuel slowly closed the wallet. Then he remembered his father's words: "Tell the truth," and his mother's: "Kindness is worth more than money." He turned and walked toward the orchard office. Inside the office sat the orchard manager, a serious-looking man named Mr. Jenkins. Samuel placed the wallet on the desk. "I found this." Mr. Jenkins looked surprised. "You opened it?" "Only to see whose it was." The manager counted the money. Nothing was missing. He nodded slowly. "I'll make sure it gets back to its owner." Samuel smiled politely and walked away. He expected nothing in return. To him, returning the wallet was simply the right thing to do. The following afternoon, an unfamiliar automobile stopped beside the Carter family's tent. A well-dressed gentleman stepped out. His coat was expensive. His shoes were polished. He looked very different from the workers living in the camp. He approached Samuel. "Are you the young man who found my wallet?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir." The man smiled warmly. "My name is Edward Whitmore. You saved me from losing something very important." Samuel answered quietly. "I'm glad I found you." Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out several dollar bills. "I'd like you to have this." Samuel looked at the money, then shook his head. "I can't." Edward looked confused. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't my money." The businessman stared at the young boy for several seconds. Finally, he smiled even wider. "Your parents raised you well." Instead of offering money, Edward asked a different question. "Do you go to school?" Samuel hesitated. "Not anymore. We've been moving too much." "What do you want to be someday?" Samuel thought for a moment. "I don't know. Maybe an engineer. Or maybe—" He remembered Benjamin's notebook. "A writer." Edward seemed impressed. "Interesting." Before leaving, he handed Samuel a small card. "If you ever need help, come find me." Samuel tucked the card safely into his pocket. That evening, he told Benjamin about the encounter. The old teacher smiled knowingly. Sometimes honesty pays in ways money never can. Samuel showed him the business card. Benjamin's eyes widened. "Do you know who Edward Whitmore is?" Samuel shook his head. "He owns one of the largest fruit packing companies in this part of California." Samuel looked surprised. "He does?" Benjamin nodded. "And apparently, he now knows your name." Several weeks passed. Samuel almost forgot about the wallet. Then one rainy afternoon, another letter arrived at the camp. It wasn't addressed to Thomas or Mary. It was addressed to Samuel Carter. Inside was a short note. "Dear Samuel, I have not forgotten your honesty. If you are interested, I have a small after-school job at my warehouse. It doesn't pay much, but every great career begins somewhere. Edward Whitmore." Samuel could hardly believe his eyes. Thomas read the letter twice, then looked proudly at his son. "You earned this, not because you were lucky, but because you chose to do the right thing." The next morning, Samuel walked nearly 4 miles to Whitmore's fruit warehouse. The building was enormous. Workers loaded wooden crates onto railroad cars headed for cities across America. Everything moved with incredible speed. Edward welcomed Samuel personally. "I need someone to help organize shipping records. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." Samuel smiled. "I'd be honored." Every afternoon after helping his parents in the orchard, Samuel worked several hours in the warehouse. At first, his job was simple: carrying paperwork, sorting invoices, sweeping floors. But Samuel paid attention to everything. He watched how shipments were organized, how workers communicated, how managers solved problems. Edward noticed. One evening he asked, "Why do you watch everyone so carefully?" Samuel answered, "Because every day someone knows something I don't." Edward laughed. "That's exactly how successful people think." Meanwhile, Benjamin continued teaching beneath the oak tree. Only now, Samuel often shared what he had learned at the warehouse. The younger children listened with fascination. For the first time since losing his farm, Samuel felt something growing inside him: confidence. Not because life had become easy, but because he realized he could shape his own future. As winter slowly faded, Edward invited Samuel into his office. He pointed toward a large bookshelf. "Choose one." Samuel looked confused. "Choose what?" "A book. Any book."
Samuel carefully selected one titled The Lives of Great American Inventors. Edward smiled. Keep it. Samuel looked surprised. I don't have money to buy it. You don't need to. The only condition is that when you're finished, you'll tell me what you learned. Samuel hugged the book tightly. It was the first new book he had ever owned. That night, by the light of a small oil lantern inside the family tent, Samuel began reading. Every page introduced him to people who had failed countless times before achieving success. Inventors, builders, scientists, leaders. None of them had easy lives. Many had faced poverty, rejection, failure, yet they continued. Benjamin's words echoed in his mind. Success belongs to people who keep walking after everyone else stops. For the first time in years, Samuel stopped thinking only about surviving tomorrow. He began dreaming about the future again. As spring approached in 1931, the Carter family remained poor. They still worked long hours. They still counted every penny. But something invisible had changed. Hope was no longer just a wish. It had become a plan. Samuel now believed that honesty, education, and determination could open doors that money never could. And soon, a new opportunity would arrive, one that could change not only Samuel's life, but the future of his entire family. The greatest chapter of his journey was still ahead.
He wrote about Benjamin's stories beneath the old oak tree, and he wrote about his parents, people who had lost nearly everything except their dignity. One afternoon, Edward Whitmore called Samuel into his office. The older businessman placed several papers on his desk. "I've been watching you." Samuel looked nervous. "I'm sorry if I've made mistakes." Edward smiled. "Everyone makes mistakes, but very few people learn as quickly as you." He slid the papers across the desk. "I've spoken with a friend who runs a business school in Sacramento. They're willing to offer you a scholarship." Samuel stared at the papers in disbelief. "A scholarship?" Edward nodded. "It won't cover everything, but it will give you a chance." Samuel's hands trembled. No one in his family had ever gone beyond a small country school. College had always been a dream for other people, not for boys who lived in tents. That evening, Samuel shared the news with his parents. Mary covered her mouth with both hands. Tears filled her eyes. Thomas remained silent for several moments. Finally, he stood and hugged his son. It was one of the few times Samuel had ever seen his father cry. "I always hoped you'd have a better life than mine." "You already do." Samuel shook his head. "Only because you taught me how." Benjamin smiled when he heard the news. "I told you your story wasn't finished." Samuel laughed. "I didn't believe you." Benjamin handed him another notebook. "This one's for the next chapter." "What should I write now?" Benjamin answered softly. "Write about what comes after hardship. People need hope just as much as they need history." The months that followed brought small but meaningful changes. Thomas earned steadier work supervising crews in the orchard. Mary found employment at a local cannery, helping prepare fruit for shipment. Emily finally returned to school. She quickly became one of the best readers in her class. The family was still far from wealthy, but for the first time in years, they could plan for tomorrow instead of simply surviving today. Across America, change was also beginning. Communities organized soup kitchens, churches opened shelters, neighbors shared tools, food, and clothing. People slowly discovered that rebuilding a nation required more than government programs. It required ordinary citizens helping one another. The Depression revealed the worst of financial systems, but it also revealed the very best of human character. In 1933, a new president took office. Across the country, people gathered around their radios to hear his first address. His words echoed through homes, farms, and migrant camps alike. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." For many Americans, those words became a turning point. Recovery would not happen overnight, but hope had returned. Roads would be built, parks restored, bridges constructed, jobs slowly reappeared. America began taking its first cautious steps toward recovery. Samuel started attending business classes while continuing to work part-time for Edward Whitmore. He studied accounting, engineering, writing, economics. Every subject fascinated him. He realized something important. Education was not simply about earning a living. It was about understanding the world. The notebook Benjamin had given him filled with observations, lessons, and dreams. Some nights he stayed awake long after midnight, writing by the light of a small lamp. Years passed. America slowly recovered. Factories reopened. Businesses expanded. Families once again purchased homes. Children returned to schools. The scars of the Great Depression remained, but life moved forward. Samuel graduated with honors. Edward offered him a permanent position helping manage the growing fruit company. Samuel accepted, not because it paid well, but because it gave him the opportunity to help other struggling families find honest work. Whenever possible, he hired people who reminded him of his own father, hardworking, honest, determined. One warm summer afternoon, nearly 20 years after leaving Kansas, Samuel drove east with his parents. The road seemed strangely familiar. Miles of open prairie stretched before them. Finally, they reached the place they had once called home. The old farmhouse was gone. Time had claimed it years before. Only the stone foundation remained. The red barn had disappeared. The windmill no longer stood. But something had survived. The oak tree. The tiny sapling Samuel and his father had planted together had become a magnificent tree. Its branches stretched proudly into the Kansas sky. Thomas walked slowly toward it. He gently placed one weathered hand against its trunk. It kept growing. Samuel smiled.
So did we. For several minutes, no one spoke. They simply stood beneath the shade of the tree. The tree had become more than wood and leaves. It had become a symbol. Storms had bent its branches. Winters had stripped away its leaves. Yet every spring, it grew again. Many years later, Samuel became a successful businessman and writer. He never forgot the lessons of the Depression. He established scholarships for children from poor farming families. He donated books to rural schools. He quietly paid college tuition for students who couldn't afford it. When people asked why he gave away so much of his success, he always answered the same way. Because once, someone believed in me. Benjamin Harris lived long enough to read Samuel's first published book. On the first page, Samuel wrote a dedication. For Benjamin Harris, who taught me that history is more than dates. It is the story of ordinary people who refuse to give up. Benjamin smiled as he finished the final page. You finally wrote it. Samuel nodded. No, we wrote it. As the years passed, Samuel often spoke to young students. He rarely talked about money. Instead, he asked a simple question. What would you do if you lost everything? The room usually became quiet. Then Samuel would smile. I know the answer. You begin again. The Great Depression remains one of the most difficult chapters in American history. More than 13 million Americans lost their jobs. Thousands of banks failed. Countless families lost their homes and farms. Children grew up knowing hunger, uncertainty, and sacrifice. Yet from that suffering came extraordinary courage. Communities learned to care for one another. Neighbors became family. Strangers shared their last piece of bread. And millions of ordinary Americans proved that resilience could survive even the darkest times. Samuel Carter was fictional, but his journey represents the lives of countless real Americans who endured the Great Depression. Their names may not appear in history books, their photographs may never hang in museums, but their courage built the America that future generations inherited. They taught us that success is never guaranteed, that wealth can disappear overnight, that kindness costs nothing, and that hope is sometimes the strongest thing a person can possess. If you ever travel across the American Midwest, you may pass an old oak tree standing alone in a quiet field. Perhaps no one remembers who planted it. Perhaps no sign marks its history. But trees remember, the wind remembers, and history remembers, because the greatest heroes are not always soldiers, or presidents, or famous inventors. Sometimes they are ordinary families who simply refuse to give up.